Hello, my name is Emily Park, and the working title for my thesis is Generative Grief in Pachinko, the Potential of Grief in the Pacific Arena. As a story about loss, displacement, and survival, Pachinko highlights the grief-driven experience of a family before, during, and after Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. For the purposes of my thesis, I will be focusing on Sunja, the second-generation daughter, and her son Noah, beginning with the hidden truth of Noah's birth father and Noah's subsequent suicide. I argue that as we follow their lives, Lee writes moments of displacement and loss that force both Noah and Sunja to constantly reposition and self-determinate, illustrating the regenerative potential of grief without fetishizing grief as opportunistic or painless. In doing so, Lee negates the fetishization of resiliency, specifically in the context of post-colonial Korea, pushing against neoliberal ideologies that pathologize grief against narratives of resilience. I will now move into my theoretical context. I am using Helen June's Asian Americans in the Age of Neoliberalism, in which she argues that the formation of Asian/American racialization is directly in relation to neoliberal tenets of economics, outlining the human capital ideologies that mandate specific behaviors and dispositions of Asian/American subjects. Please pause the video to read more on that. In connection to the ways in which neoliberalism demands certain dispositions of the Asian/American subject in the name of human capital, we can then connect to Gina Kim's claims of neoliberal fetishization of resilience as an example of these dispositions. In Post-Colonial Grief, the Afterlives of the Pacific Wars of the Americas, Kim argues, with respect to the Pacific arena and World War II and Cold War-era warfare, that the rhetoric of resiliency subsequently pathologizes grief and imposes ideologies of personal responsibility, which allows neoliberal regimes to evade accountability, reparations, or acknowledgments of wrongdoing. Please pause the video to read more about this. In reading the ways in which grief manifests in Pachinko, Lee not only establishes the stakes of grief through Noah and his death, but also the ways in which grief can become a reclamation and a redetermination of what remains after loss through Sunja and her reclamation of Noah's death. Though Lee allows for a generative reading of grief, she does not fetishize the melancholia caused by grief and instead complicates and grounds this melancholia through Noah and his death. Lee outlines the stakes of grief through the action of self-destruction, which Erin Quinn Ning writes about in her book Ingratitude, the Debt-Bound Daughter in Asian American Literature. According to Ning, using capitalism as a model of debt, the family structure institutes the child-parent relationship as a debtor-creditor relationship through feelings of ingratitude. The weaponization of filial obligation manifests through the non-ending cycle of indebtedness for the child, which establishes a perpetual state of melancholy that is normalized within the family structure. Please pause the video to read more on this as well. These three theoretical texts establish the following framework. The ways in which Sunja and Noah constantly reposition and refashion themselves in relation to their grief illustrates the ways in which grief can be generative, that is not used as utility to further a neoliberal structure of human capital, but rather ways of existing and surviving through grief. My thesis holds this generative potential in tandem with Noah's suicide and the weighty implications of melancholia, identifying the family structure as an instrument of capitalist enterprise that perpetuates grief through feelings of ingratitude. Through Noah, Lee complicates the implications of grief and resists any fetishization of melancholia. The first illustration of refashioning I would like to discuss is Sunja's split from her mother, Yangjin. In this interaction between Sunja and her mother, Sunja says goodbye after agreeing to marry Peck Isaac, a Protestant pastor who agrees to give her son his name even though he is not the birth father, shifting Sunja's identity from her mother's family to Peck Isaac's family. Yangjin's goodbye is painful, telling her daughter that, quote, she has no right, end quote, to see her again, a declaration of Sunja's shift in loyalties, solidifying just how much this marriage changes Sunja's emotional attachments. Yangjin's rhetorical question, quote, do you know what that's like for a mother, end quote, reads as a defeated bitterness, facing the hard truth that Sunja is leaving her family. Youngjin's short, concise sentences read as crammed tidbits of wisdom, as though this is her last chance to advise her daughter, commanding Sunja to take care, treat, and obey. The breaking of Youngjin and Sunja's relationship as simple mother and daughter illustrates the shift that Sunja makes in order to survive. Youngjin invokes Sunja's father, and in doing so, allows Sunja to run parallel to her own father, as Sunja is doing her best for her own family. Through the pain of this moment between Youngjin and Sunja, we see the change that Sunja takes on, refashioning her own identity for the sake of herself and her child. The second illustration of generative grief, I would like to discuss is Noah's refashioning and the ways in which his legacy carries beyond his grief. For this example, I am linking two moments in the novel relating to Noah and his passion for literature. After Noah leaves his birth family and has a family of his own, he sheds his old identity for a new one. In contrast to Sunja, however, he does not let go of his past, but instead carries it with him, quote, like a rock, end quote, the language capturing the burden of his past has on him. The one thing tethering him to his former self is his love for books, taking time to remember, quote, who he is on the inside, end quote. After Noah's death, when Sunja goes to visit his grief, she runs into the groundskeeper of the cemetery, who tells her that Noah gifted him books before he passed away. In tracing Noah's identity through his love of literature, we see how, in Sunja's act of mourning, she discovers ways in which Noah continues to live through the one thing he used to stay tethered to himself, literature. In this quote, we see how Sunja's grieving of Noah becomes generative of new legacies for Noah that transcend his physical life. Given the political, physiological, and emotional moment we are all living in right now, we have had to endure much grief in the past year or so, a significant loss of human life, shifting political apparatuses, and personal life struggles. For many, the idea of overcoming the losses we have suffered seems insurmountable, but in looking for new ways that allow us to live through it, we stumble upon literature that illuminates ways to grieve that honor our losses. Thank you for listening.